Well, my name is Dave Housholder, and I teach Alpha, and I love Alpha, and I travel around the country helping Alpha courses improve. And the biggest question I get is, how do I get more people on my Alpha course? I get that all the time. Now, as a pastor, the biggest question I get is, are pets in heaven? And I never know how to answer that one. But the other question is a lot easier. How can I get more people on my Alpha course? And I'd like you to remember one phrase, if you could, and that phrase is, one size does not fit all. Churches are like people. They're different. And we can't really wear each other's clothes, and we don't fit into each other's shoes. And churches are made in lots of variety because obviously God likes it that way. So when we're putting the Alpha course in a church, to answer the question, how do I get more people on my Alpha course, the key thing to remember is to do that, the course has to be positioned well. You can't get more people on your Alpha course unless you position the course well, and that positioning has to correspond to the type of church that you're in. Now, there's lots of ways to categorize churches. There's liturgical churches and contemporary churches. There's denominational churches and non-denominational churches, but I don't want to use those kinds of categorizations right now. I'd like to use three categories of churches which helps us to position the Alpha course. And these three kinds of churches are missional, preservationist, and attractional. Let me say it again, missional, preservationist, and attractional. Now, I want to start by saying right from the very beginning that there is not one kind of church that's better than the other ones. It's not better to be a missional church than a preservational church, or better to be an attractional church than a preservationist church. All three of these churches are just like a different personality or a different size or a different kind of church. And Alpha needs to be positioned differently when it's taught in each of these three different kinds of churches. Now, when I say missional, I'd like you not to think in the terms of theologically or spiritually missional, because every church needs to be missional. I'm thinking more sociologically. So a missional church to me, for my definition, is a church that is very much programmed towards reaching lost people. It generally has very low overhead. Most of these churches are found in strip malls and in industrial parks. Most of them have a very fast track to leadership. In just a few weeks, you can actually lead one of these churches. The joke being, if you have a music stand and a stool, you can start one of these churches, and it's really pretty much true. A lot of these churches are ethnic in their orientation, non-Anglo-ethnic in their orientation, and they multiply quickly. By a preservationist church, I mean a church that is either part of a faith family or a church which itself has a really long history and heritage. And most of these churches believe that their heritage is something that has made it through Great Depressions, World Wars, famines, and everything else, and that it has staying power, and it's a form of the Christian faith that is worth passing on to the next generation. And looking at history, they're probably right. So preservationist churches have a whole bunch of structure and heritage and history which they're passing on to the next generation. An attractional church is like the one I'm sitting in right now. I'm filming from the atrium of a church in Minnesota, and the atrium is pretty much as big as the United Terminal in Chicago. It has this gigantic feel to it, and it's a very, very beautiful building. And this church is not just attractive in its architecture, it's very attractive socially. It's like a magnet. People want to be here. And attractional churches tend to be very large. They tend to have what we call branding. The church has its own font, its own colors, its own vibe, its own sense. The teaching is usually primary and not derivative. There's a certain kind of teaching coming out of the church which isn't really being taken from anywhere else. And so your church is probably either missional or preservationist or attractional. Now, chances are it's not a pure version of any of those three forms of churches. It's probably a mixture of those. But if you could, talk to some of the leaders in your church and ask them, which of these three are we primarily?